IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio. IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio.
Welcome to the IndyPram Podcast on Independence Live Radio. Scotland the Brief by Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp, Part 7. How the Croydon Principle Works. Now that you know Scotland is not subsidised and that any money covering an illustrative deficit is money the UK borrows, that Scotland has to pay interest on, and that Scotland would not have any debt had it been an independent nation. The argument that Scotland has a deficit and so cannot afford independence seems a bit silly, doesn't it? Well, there is another spending principle that also removes wealth from Scotland, which I call the Croydon Principle. This is summed up best by the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who said, "A pound spent in Croydon is of far more value to the country than a pound spent in Strathclyde. You will generate jobs in Strathclyde far more effectively if you invest in parts of London." For example, the UK government manages and pays the wages of civil servants who do work on Scotland's behalf but are not based in Scotland. It also employs civil servants who work in areas not devolved but who are based in Scotland, such as the Department for Work and Pensions and the staff of job centres. In terms of the cost of work done outside Scotland, the Scottish Government has a population percentage share of the salary and related expenditure allocated as a Scotland cost in GERS. Some people worry about the cost of the new civil servants Scotland would need, but most of them work in Scotland for the UK Government already, and GERS includes the cost of their wages. Those that don't live in Scotland, however, have their national insurance and tax contributions applied to the accounts of the regions where they live and not to Scotland, which pays their wages. There are dozens of examples, but one you will probably be familiar with is the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, the DVLA. Located in Swansea, it is one of the largest employers in South Wales, with roughly 6,000 staff, and handles driver and vehicle licensing for the whole of the UK. Assuming that an independent Scotland wanted to set up its own SDVLA, it would need to employ roughly the same number of staff currently working in the Swansea DVLA on Scotland's behalf. That would create 498 new jobs in Scotland, at a median civil servant salary of £26,610, or a total salary cost of £13.3 million a year. But that's not an additional cost to Scotland, which already pays for their wages in its budget. Taking the median salary and applying current Scottish rates of tax would roughly indicate that in total those civil servants would contribute £4.4 million per year in tax and national insurance to the Scottish Government. Then these 498 new Scottish-based employees would all have to buy cars, food, clothes and houses, which would add roughly £12.7 million in purchasing power to Scotland's economy. That spending would then generate VAT, contribute to economic growth, and generate approximately another £2.5 million in tax revenue for the Scottish Government. The impact of hiring new civil servants in Scotland would mean the cost remains the same, but the Scottish Government gains £6.9 million in additional revenues. Sure, there would be a transition cost, offices to set up and rent, but office costs in Scotland are not that high and up to 31% cheaper than for those based in London, which is another saving. To be clear, every time a civil servant role working on Scotland's behalf in the rest of the UK moves to Scotland, the Scottish Government makes a saving of £12,710. The most common claim in terms of how many additional civil servants Scotland would require to run a fully independent government is between 24,000 and 25,000. The most common claim in terms of how many additional civil servants Scotland would require to run a fully independent government is between 24,000 and 25,000. This number, it seems, is driven by the fact that the UK government employs 24,900 civil servants on Scotland's behalf. The cost of those civil servants is then added as a cost to GERS, so it doesn't make sense to assume that there would be any extra cost. as they are already paid for them from the Scottish Government's budget. It is also the case that many of those civil servants are already based in Scotland, but working for the UK Government in non-devolved departments such as the DWP or the Ministry of Defence. Work done by the London School of Economics identified that in total, 6,640 public sector jobs would need to be created in or transferred to Scotland to support the governance infrastructure of Scotland as an independent nation. That 6,640 new civil servants added to the 42,300 currently working in Scotland, 17,400 on devolved areas and 24,900 on non-devolved areas. The total is 48,940. The UK Government currently charges Scotland a population share of the UK civil service for 51,794. In effect, Scotland currently pays for 2,854 civil servants it might not need. That would be another saving, not a cost, of independence. As a result, most of the expenditure figures in GERS are entirely contestable in terms of where they should be applied, and in some areas, such as defence, most of the spending does not directly benefit Scotland economically. We have the inflated expenditure figures, but not the corresponding tax and national insurance income, nor the economic benefits of jobs being based in Scotland, all of which would boost spending and the taxation revenue side of the accounts. The Barnett formula myth exploded. It does not subsidise Scotland. Arguably the most misunderstood part of the UK public sector budgeting mechanism is the Barnett formula. The vast majority of people, politicians and the media seem to think that Barnett represents a subsidy to Scotland. Many Westminster MPs, mainly Conservative, have described it as English taxpayers subsidising Scottish public spending, and the mainstream media have run headlines along those lines. There is just one little problem with that idea. It's complete and utter nonsense. The Barnett formula was introduced as a funding mechanism containing a mathematical formula that aimed to reduce Scotland's funding in comparison to England's. To understand why it exists and how it was supposed to reduce Scotland's public spending, we need to understand the Scotland of the 1970s, when it was first introduced. The Barnett formula's predecessor, the Goshen formula, had been used between 1889 and 1959, before negotiation of budgets by Secretaries of State became the norm. Scotland was an industrial powerhouse, and its economy and the public sector revenues generated meant that the Secretaries of State for Scotland had real negotiating power in budget discussions. The Barnett formula was first devised in Scotland in 1978 as a temporary response to the potential devolution of powers to a Scottish Parliament after the 1979 devolution referendum, and thus Barnett would replace the annual budget negotiations. The referendum result saw 51.6% of voters in Scotland voting for devolution. However, fearing that would happen, a Labour MP for an English constituency successfully tabled an amendment to the Referendum Act that stipulated that more than 40% of the total Scottish electorate would have to vote yes in the referendum for devolution to be enacted. Even though the result was 51.6% yes, the turnout was only 64%. So as a percentage of the total electorate, only 32.9% voted yes. And so despite winning the referendum, devolution was denied to the people of Scotland. Fearing a collapse of influence in future budget negotiations, consecutive Scottish Secretaries of State argued to maintain the Barnett formula, as they knew that, at least in the short term, it would maintain Scottish public sector spending at higher levels per head than in England. The Treasury, presumably understanding the mathematics of the formula, knew that over time it would reduce real-term spending in Scotland to parity with English levels, and was only too happy to agree. If the Barnett formula had succeeded and it reduced Scotland's public sector spending down to parity with England's, That would just mean that the Scottish surplus we highlighted in the debt loading section would have been higher than they were. Scotland would therefore have been even better off as an independent nation than the figures we presented earlier in this chapter. The reason that Scottish public spending remains higher to this day is largely due to unforeseen devolution complications and no other reason. That is why many Westminster politicians want to replace it with a formula that would presumably be more effective at cutting Scotland's budget. So how does the Barnett formula work? Scottish public sector revenues are collected by the UK and Scottish governments and sent to the UK Treasury. Spending reviews take place normally over 5-year periods and when the budget for England is completed. The Barnett formula is applied. This aims to give each country the same pounds per person change in funding as the change in the funding for comparable government services in England. Then, based on the calculation, the Scottish Government receives a block grant back from the Treasury on which to fund the expenditure it is responsible for under devolution. This block grant is not in any way based on the needs of Scotland or on the levels of revenue generated in Scotland. The Barnett formula for Scotland at its simplest. It is a case of additional funding agreed for England in the spending review times Scotland's population as a percentage of England's times the percentage of the budget that relates to devolved spending, and that equals additional funding added to Scotland's block grant. It's fairly simple, and the comparability factor is again in simple terms the percentage amount of the budget responsibility devolved to the Scottish Parliament. For example, education is 100% devolved, and so the comparability factor is 100%. In defence spending, where Westminster makes all the decisions, and the comparability factor is 0. How does it work in practice? Health. For example, the UK government announced plans to increase spending on the NHS by an average of 3.4% in every year for the 5-year period starting with the 2018-2019 and ending with the 2022 and 2023 year. So the increases in England's health spending will be, in the years 2018 to 2024, the starting budget is £114.6 billion, £118.5 billion, £122.53 billion, £126.69 billion, £131 billion, and £135.45 billion. The resultant increase of 3.4% average announced increase would equate to 3.9 billion, 4.03 billion, 4.17 billion, 4.31 billion, and 4.45 billion. The Barnett formula is then applied, which takes the increase in England and multiplies it first by the comparability percentage, which is the amount of funding for areas that are devolved, and in health that is 99.4%. Then it multiplies that figure by Scotland's population share of England's population, which is 9.85%. Now, you might think that England's NHS budget rises by 3.4%, so should Scotland's. However, the Barnett formula was not designed to mean a rise in England's spending would be passed on in percentage terms in Scotland. That would be such a simple calculation it would hardly need a formula or a fancy name. So let us see what happens if you just give Scotland's NHS's budget the same percentage increase as England is getting as a result of the review, namely 3.4%. Instead of 381 million, it would be 450 million. Instead of 394 million, it would be 460 million. Instead of 408 million, it would be 480 million. Instead of 422 million, it would be 490 million. Instead of 436 million, it would be 510 million. As you can see, the Barnett formula doesn't pass on the full 3.4%. In fact, over the 5-year period, the cumulative increase in Scotland's budget under the Barnett formula is 2.042 billion. But if the English percentage increase was applied, the cumulative budget improvement would have been £2.39 billion, a whole £343 million higher across the 5 years. Let's be clear. The Barnett formula means that in the budget areas where it applies, spending in Scotland is reduced on a per-head basis in comparison to the increases received in England. Why does this happen? Well, Scotland's health budget per head is larger than England's. It always has been. And so the per-head calculation means that the increase overall will result in a smaller percentage increase in total budget in Scotland. This is known as the Barnett squeeze and proves that the Barnett formula has a built-in mechanism to lower the Scottish Government's spending until it reaches parity with England's. Should Scotland's health budget be higher per head than England's? Well, given Westminster has run a policy of deindustrialisation and financialisation, causing population growth to be slow in Scotland, and indeed the other smaller home nations, then you have less people, lower population density, and an ageing population and higher levels of poverty. Then there is a justifiable need to spend more. Add to that the fact that, as proven earlier in this chapter, Scotland in reality subsidises the rest of the UK. It seems a bit dishonest to devise a formula to cut that vital health spending and then tell the Scottish people that the formula is a boost or a bonus to their nation which they cannot afford to live without. The Barnett formula has the same impact across many of Scotland's most important spending areas. But let's finish by considering the real-world impact of Scotland's health spending by illustrating what that missing £340 million of budget increases denied to Scotland's NHS across the 5 years would have paid for. If Scotland were to have received the full 3.4% increase, as in England, then looking at the average of the salary ranges for the medical staff the Scottish NHS would have been able to hire, 972 new GPs in 2018-2019, 3,756 new healthcare assistants in 2019-2020, 750 additional consultant doctors in 2020-21, 1,447 nurse consultants in 2021-22, 1,030 consultant paramedics in 2022-2023. In stark terms, the Barnett formula will withhold from Scotland, over the 5 years covered by the spending review, enough money to have hired approximately 7,955 additional NHS medical professionals. That's not a bonus. It's a smoke and mirrors mechanism that aims to reduce the Scottish Government's spending power in real terms. Westminster's economic mismanagement. We have already seen that the UK is in no position to bail out or subsidise Scotland. In reality, that subsidy has gone the other way. Brexit may be a case study on the Westminster government's incompetence, but even pre-Brexit we have seen that the UK's debt spiral to £1,821.3 billion, equivalent to 85.2% of GDP. The UK's banking system, upon which it is overly dependent, collapse. Austerity cutting investment services. A slowing of investment, dragging on economic growth, meaning the UK has the worst growth in Western and Northern Europe, and the worst in the G20. The UK's pension fall below levels of common decency, to being the lowest in the developed world as a percentage of final earnings. The UK's World Bank Good Governance score fallen to 57 out of 100 for political stability, and it has changed prime ministers again since then. The UK's exports per capita are less than half of Scotland's, and its international trade deficit is £134.98 billion. Wages in the UK fell in excess of 3% between 2007 and 2015, falling slower only than poverty-stricken Greece in the developed world. Zero-hour contracts in the UK increased fourfold since 2000. The UK has the second longest full-time working hours in Europe, 2 hours more than the EU average, but its productivity per hour worked is just more than half of Ireland's and has only outperformed former Eastern Bloc nations such as Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, who all rate ahead of the UK in overall economic terms. The second largest oil production in Europe, yet the highest fuel taxes in the EU. The United Nations has deemed the UK's cruel austerity policies as a breach of disabled people's human rights. On top of all of that, the UK government has decided to leave the EU without any guarantee of a trade deal being in place by the end of the 2020 transition period. If you are wondering why the UK is so badly run, then maybe this will give you a clue. The UK has the second largest unelected chamber in the world. The House of Lords, with more than 800 members, is the second largest unelected legislative body in the world, surpassed only by authoritarian China. Let's look at a specific epic case study of Westminster economic mismanagement. Norway and the UK have managed their oil and gas industries very differently, resulting in a substantial contrast of fortunes in their economies. A key argument against independence is the claim that Scotland would be too small a nation to maximise the benefit of its oil industry. However, when comparing the UK and Norway's oil and gas production and their revenues generated from this industry, we can see that Norway has generated £386 billion more than the UK government in tax revenues since the production of oil and gas began. If Norway had produced significantly more oil and gas than the UK, this may be understandable. However, this is not the case. Instead, the UK has produced 1% more oil and gas than Norway overall. A comparative loss of £386 billion in tax revenue amounts to a significant failure in resource governance by the UK government. With comparative geologies, original production costs, oil grades, prices and resources, Norway, a country very similar to Scotland in population and geography, has collected a huge revenue windfall, whilst Scotland has not. We have already explained the cumulative deficits, or the share of the UK's national debt that has been loaded onto Scotland's accounts. However, it is worth noting that even with debt loading and the Croydon principle, Scotland's indicative deficit in GERS was lower than the UK's for 33 of the 38 years for which we have figures. So what changed? The price of oil crashed in 2015. Brent crude averaged $52 a barrel in 2015, after having averaged $98 per barrel in 2014. If the claims that Scotland was dependent on oil and gas were true, then Scotland's economy would have crashed with it. However, Scotland's economy did not even enter into recession. Economic growth for the year was negative at 0.04%, but the onshore economy grew 1.6%, according to the GDP figures in the 2015-2016 GERS report, as the benefit of lower oil prices boosted the onshore economy. Hardly the Armageddon predicted during the independence referendum if oil prices dropped, never mind crashed the way they did. Contrast that with the collapse of the financial markets in 2007, upon which the UK's economy was twice as dependent on as Scotland was on oil. This led to 6 consecutive quarters of negative growth, in other words, a recession, from March 2008 to July 2009. We now know that the UK government's natural resource management track record is dire. Even so, the GERS reports show a smaller deficit for Scotland than for the UK until the oil crash, and the economy stayed pretty much the same from 2014-2015 to 2015-2016. So why did oil and gas revenues drop to a deficit of £209 million in 2016-2017 before recovering to £1.25 billion in 2018-2019? The answer is that the UK government stopped collecting tax from the big oil companies. In response to falling oil prices, the UK government decided to cut petroleum revenue tax in 2015 from 50% to 35%, and in 2016 it was further reduced to 0%. The supplementary charge was also cut from 62% to 50% to 10% during the same time. This meant that the UK earned less in tax revenues from its oil and gas industry. Despite oil prices rising again and stabilising at between $60 and $70, and increased production and cost-cutting helping to lower some UK production costs to around $15 per barrel, the zero petroleum revenue tax rate meant that revenue will not increase in line with oil company profits. This also means that the illustrative Scottish deficit figure will not reduce, as tax revenues are negligible. This has led to Shell, for example, receiving tax rebates in 2018 from the UK government of £105.48 million. Those show up in Scotland's GERS report as a loss on North Sea operations of £105.48 million. At the same time, Shell paid Norway $3,154 million in taxes. That's good for Shell, a company that remained in profit during the oil price drop, which recorded profits in 2015 of $3.84 billion, then $3.5 billion, then $15.8 billion, and a massive $21.4 billion in 2018. It was the oil workers of Aberdeen and the North Sea services companies, more often Scottish-owned, that took the hit when the price crashed. The UK government protected the big oil companies and their shareholders. From their last sets of accounts, the profits declared by the four largest oil majors operating in the North Sea were as follows. Shell, $21.4 billion. BP, $12.7 billion. Exxon, $20.8 billion. ConocoPhillips, $6.3 billion. The North Sea giants Shell and BP are now more profitable than they were before the oil price crash and have received billions in tax cuts and credits between them. Maybe it's now time to start phasing in the taxes again and investing the profits in renewable energy projects. This, of course, would return Scotland's finances to the default setting of better than the UK's. So the UK government's decision to significantly reduce tax on oil companies has had a major impact on Scotland's national accounts, leading them to show a larger fiscal deficit than the rest of the UK. Since 2015, £1.822 billion has been lost from the petroleum revenue tax alone. This support to large oil companies, whether necessary, advisable or otherwise, was managed through tax rebates, which have effectively wiped out Scotland's North Sea revenues. Around 60% of the cost of the petroleum revenue tax cut is deducted from Scotland's accounts in GERS, which cost Scotland around £340 million in 2017-2018. To make this clearer, when the UK government lowers a set of revenues which is almost completely attributed to Scotland as a region of the UK, there is a major reduction in tax revenues assigned to GERS. On the other hand, if the UK government had maintained tax levels but then offered grants from the Treasury retrospectively for decommissioning and exploration, then only a population percentage of 8.4% of the cost of that grant support would have been deducted, and the illustrative deficit in GERS would have been smaller than the UK's, not larger. Smoke and mirrors? Observations. In the 1970s, Scottish oil revenues stopped the UK from going bust and requiring a bailout, but they were not enough to stop the UK debt mountain from growing. Scotland was then allocated a population percentage share of the cost of servicing that debt as well. Despite this double bailout of the UK, Scotland's economy and its finances still managed to show a higher GDP per head and lower illustrative deficits than the UK until 2015. At that point, the UK's mishandling of Scotland's oil and gas wealth caught up with it, and it decided to slash Scotland's oil revenues, which finally made Scotland's finances look falsely worse than the rest of the UK's. It's the UK's deficit, not Scotland's. If an independent Scotland had done the daftest thing it could have done with its historic surpluses, then as a nation Scotland would be £508 billion richer than Gers suggests it is as part of the UK. If it had simply copied Norway, Scotland would have £773 billion in a Scottish wealth fund right now. Business for Scotland has been explaining for years that Westminster is completely economically incompetent, that Westminster truly doesn't care about the impact of its policies on Scotland and is deliberately acting against Scotland's best interests. Now, however, Brexit is making that thinking mainstream, and slowly but surely, as Brexit unravels, more and more people are beginning to see that Scotland cannot afford to continue subsidising this failing, disinterested and dysfunctional union. The evidence is clear. The UK government has created a situation where Scotland's finances show a false deficit, one that is not related to the economic performance of Scotland. Pro-union politicians and the ill-informed mainstream media point to that false deficit and say it is proof that Scotland cannot afford to be independent. This will continue until the SNP government becomes more assertive and gets better at explaining what Gers actually proves emphatically is that Scotland's economy is remarkably resilient and resistant to oil price fluctuations, that it is underperforming due to carrying the weight of generations of Westminster economic incompetence and wrong-headed thinking on its back. The Scottish Government must grasp the thistle and publish alongside Gers a set of accounts for devolved spending that demonstrates that it does not create the deficits and a projection of the real costs and revenues of an independent Scotland. Conclusions. This book set out to uncover the facts and make an analysis of the data to answer the question, does Scotland have what it takes to succeed economically and allow our society to thrive as an independent nation? The answer is not only a very definitive yes, but the evidence demonstrates that it is absurd to even suggest Scotland would not be one of the wealthiest and most successful nations in the world. So why do we even need to ask the question? The people of Scotland live in a country where the mainstream press fall over themselves to play down the natural strengths of the Scottish economy and the nation's potential. They point out the size of the illustrative financial deficit that Scotland has been allocated as part of the United Kingdom, and from this they report politics and economics through a lens that distorts the truth about Scotland's economy. Who gains from this web of doubt so skillfully and persistently woven? The answer is London and the South East, where the voters that create Scotland's democratic deficit live, as well as the Westminster establishment and its enabling institutions, including the main Westminster political parties. Clearly, the people of Scotland need a better question to ask. It's a simple and pointed question, and one that any self-respecting journalist should consider before republishing any economic scare story handed to them in the form of evidence-free press releases. They should simply ask, how come? How come when Scotland is a country with an embarrassment of economic advantages do we supposedly have a financial deficit greater than any other independent nation of a similar size? How come being run from Westminster is supposed to be such an advantage, when Gers clearly demonstrates that it is not? How come every small to medium-sized independent nation in Northern and Western Europe performs significantly better than the UK across a range of economic and well-being measures? Those nations would love to have Scotland's oil and use it to benefit their own citizens. Norway does, and it is far more reliant on oil than Scotland. However, it has been saving up for a rainy day. They can increase investment to stimulate growth and save jobs by investing from its oil fund. How come the Westminster government didn't do that? Sure, the UK government gave big tax breaks to the big corporations that run the oil industry, but the jobs still melted away. As always, they helped the big corporations, not the people. We got lucky with oil, and now again with renewables. Let's not make the same mistake and see either underinvestment in the sector or treated as another cash cow by Westminster. As part of the UK, billions were siphoned away from Scotland when we should have been investing and diversifying and strengthening our economy instead of paying off UK debt. The answer this book provides to the how-come question is that these nations get to make decisions for themselves. They get to elect governments that create bespoke policies for their economic and social needs, not ones for a larger neighbouring country with vastly different priorities and needs. Those smaller independent nations choose governments which are better placed to understand and solve problems, as well as realise the opportunities of the country they represent, as they have only their nation's best interests at heart. When the UK government strategy has been for generations ripping the wealth, youth, talent, power and opportunity out of other nations, to then drain them into the London and South East bubble and load them with costs for debt they didn't need, it becomes inevitable that the accounts of other regions will show false deficits. Phony deficits are not an argument against independence. They are an argument for independence. Financially, Scotland has been held back by being tethered to the failing London-centric UK economy. Scotland's economy has been drowned in UK-created debt, unable to reinvest to grow its own economy and provide economic security for its people. Despite all this, it still generates more GDP per head than the rest of the UK and also weathered the oil price crash so much better than the UK weathered the financial crash. This simply demonstrates the resilience, breadth and potential for Scotland's economy as an independent nation. So, of course, Scotland has what it takes. It possesses massive natural wealth. It is an exporting powerhouse and an innovation nation. It possesses highly advanced economic, government, trade and societal infrastructure and a significant advantage in human capital. Scotland's economy is broad-based and is more diverse than the UK's. It is not dependent on any single sector. It is resilient to shocks and contains clusters of leading-edge businesses in several industrial sectors with high growth potential. Our oil and gas sector is thriving again, whilst our renewable sector is poised to take over and more than replace traditional oil revenues as the world moves to carbon-free energy. Smaller northern and western European nations provide a case study, proving that small, agile, focused and independent nations have a significant economic advantage over larger, cumbersome and inflexible nations such as the UK. The idea that the size of the UK's economy, its performance or even its long-term economic prospects offer Scotland some form of protection or advantage has been completely and utterly disproven by the data in this book. We do not benefit from the broad shoulders of the UK, rather the burden of the UK's inadequacies in governing Scotland sits on our shoulders like a dead weight. That dead weight was identified by our finance research, where we found that if an independent Scotland had done the daftest thing it could have done with its 1980s surpluses, then as a nation Scotland would be £508 billion richer than it is, according to GERS, as part of the UK today. If Scotland had simply copied Norway, it would have at least £773 billion in a Scottish sovereign wealth fund right now. The economic case for independence is simple. Scotland is far more likely to thrive as an independent nation. This holds true even if the UK maintained its membership of the European Union. For a few hundred years, the military alliance between Scotland and England that sits at the heart of the Union allowed both nations to prosper, to conquer most of the world, to dominate the world's economy and to usher in a new industrial age. That model is now bust and irrelevant. In your lifetime, the cost of being part of the UK has been enormous for Scotland. The UK is broken and Scotland's answer has been to seek more powers and flexibility to mitigate the problems of Westminster's incompetence. The UK's answer has been Brexit, an option Scotland has wholeheartedly rejected. Leaving the EU's common market and customs union is effectively the equivalent of building a gigantic wall around the UK. A wall with only a few narrow entry points and exits that will charge businesses, people, investments, exports and imports to pass through it, and which will create unnecessary delays. A no-deal Brexit simply builds that wall higher and makes it more expensive to cross. Many people in 2014 said that their heart said yes, but their head said no. They wanted to vote for independence, but they were just unsure and worried about the changes that independence would bring. Well, now there is no status quo to cling on to. The UK will leave the EU on January the 31st, 2020. Change is coming, one way or another. Brexit closes the doors to opportunity, but independence reopens them, and today the UK that Scotland voted to stay part of in 2014 no longer exists. Going forward, the key question now for the people of Scotland is what sort of nation we want to build. Do we want a progressive, fairer, more equal, sustainable and successful, pluralistic, internationally focused Scotland? A smaller nation that's thinking big? Or do we want to remain part of a post-Brexit Britain, the bigger nation that has started thinking small? The economic facts are clear. Your heart and your head can now operate in harmony, and all you have to do to help Scotland achieve its full potential is just believe in Scotland. Thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this series.
IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio. IndyPram.